You saw that the floor over in the big room is like not currently a floor, and sorry as well that we don't have handouts for everybody yet. Our printer broke. Kyle's working. So last week we were looked at this notion of an existential risk. The main example was extinction risks, but generally risks of events which might permanently and drastically curtail our future potential. And then the plan this week was to look a bit more systematically at what kinds of things can comprise existential risks, so what we can say about that. Because last week we looked at the arguments, some arguments that existential risks are actually extremely important and something that we should give a lot of attention to responding to. So I will largely take that as an assumption for today and look at what kinds of things could do this and what we can actually do about that. If we think that there's an argument that it's important to respond, then we should have some idea of how we actually could respond. So there are some slides, but only for the middle bit of the talk. So so first of all, I'll use the classification of existential risks that Nick Bostrom introduces in his 2013 paper, Existential Risk Prevention as Global Priority. And this is looking at basically different ways the long-term trajectory of humanity could go. And he has these little graphs, and there's an idea that this is time, and this is something, axis is something like sophistication or level of technology and ability to do stuff that we have achieved. And when we plot the line and representing humanity, and it seems like, in fact, we've generally been going up so far. And maybe there are some levels, there's a level of technological maturity, at which point we can do really most things that we will eventually be able to do, or very much more than we can today, and hopefully will have solved by that point problems of accidentally wiping this out. There's a kind of level below, which is extinction. And there's the observation that, well, where was this going in the long term? And maybe it's going up here, be a good outcome, or maybe it's things fail and we go extinct. So the idea is that we want to, that kind of the cases where we achieve this technological maturity in a good way are the good outcomes, and everything where we don't manage to achieve that is an existential risk. So this first type is where we go extinct. It's human extinction is the simplest of these. And there's ones where we survive, but we don't manage to get up to the technological maturity. So that could look like we go here and we just kind of plateau here. Or maybe we collapse and then we get up again and then we collapse and we keep on doing this. Or maybe we collapse and then we just sort of peter along at a low level and never even get up back to where we are at the moment. But without getting down as far as human extinction. And there's, for those of you who have handouts, there's a little diagram which shows that this recurrent collapse scenario at least seems perhaps implausible over very long time scales, because if you zoom out, then we'd have to have lots of these cycles of going up and going down, and never once actually breaking through the bottom and hitting extinction, or breaking through the top and going well. So maybe there are strong enough forces which actually allow for that and push us away from extinction and away from achieving some more technological maturity. But among the permanent stagnation categories, it seems like the recurrent collapse, at least indefinitely, is probably less likely. That's not to say that it's something we should pay no attention to, because we can always, it could be that we collapse and we go through this cycle a couple of times before something else happens. Then there are the other kinds of existential risk are where we actually make it to technological maturity, but for some reason this doesn't turn out to give us a good outcome. Maybe we kind of have the technological maturity and we have the ability to do all kinds of great things, but we've reached it in such a way that we're not going to. We have the technical capacity to create a lot of value in the universe, but for whatever reason, that isn't used. So this is the categories that are called flawed realizations. It isn't easy to draw on this sheet, and I think they deserve quite a lot of attention. I think there hasn't been that much study about them, and for that reason, I will not say all that much about them today. But I want to draw a distinction between things that I'm going to move off because I don't have that much to say, and things that I'm going to move off because I think that we shouldn't give them attention. So the final category is a subsequent collapse, where we achieve this technological maturity, and then for some reason something goes wrong later, and we collapse back possibly to extinction. And this just seems to be too far beyond our ability to project out or predict anything for it to be worth paying attention to today. So I think that this is this category of subsequent ruination definitely is naturally an existential risk, but it is not a category of existential risk that we should be paying attention to. I gave a very brief and weak argument that the recurrent collapse is the same.
Sorry, just to take you back a couple of minutes. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by technological maturity?
Yeah, but I don't really want to get into this. I'll say a little bit. I'm looking at... So it may be that there really is a thing such as technological maturity, so that after enough time and enough progress has been made, we kind of asymptote towards this, and then there are no new great technologies to be discovered. So Toby Ord talked about this as a possibility in his talk a couple of weeks ago, and if there is such a thing, then that is the thing I'm trying to point to, but I want to use something in that vicinity there, even if that isn't actually a thing, and just to have so much greater capabilities than we currently have that it's kind of pointless us trying to project out anything beyond this phase, because there's so many steps in the meantime that trying to affect things after we reach the technological maturity looks almost impossible. There is probably a better characterization than that in Bostrom's paper, and I'm forgetting it exactly the same. So we have these 4 different types: human extinction, and that's the one that I'm mostly going to focus on for the rest of the talk. Permanent stagnation. I think there's some very real questions about how likely these permanent stagnation scenarios are. How could we end up kind of having essentially an end to progress, or if our civilizational capabilities collapse, how likely is it that they never recover? And I think that the flawed realization scenarios are also something that should have more attention, and there has been less work on them. They are therefore a natural place to think there might be some great low-hanging fruit that researchers could go and find, but I'm not going to say so much about today. So I'm going to go on to the second section of this talk where I was going to look at extinction risks. Extinction risks are perhaps the main category that we saw examples from last week. They're the category that has been most studied. They're the category where it's most obvious when an event lies in it, because for the other things, there's extinction. You only need to kind of see as far into the future as the extinction event, and then you're pretty sure, yes, that was indeed an existential catastrophe. That was bad. For something where, in fact, it's a flawed realization of technological maturity, to be able to successfully identify that involves projecting out far further into the future than an extinction risk, because it might be that you can't actually evaluate whether it did turn out to be an existential catastrophe or not until very much later. And I think that this makes them harder to study and explains partially why they have been less studied. But it also means that they are just harder for us to interact with productively and recognize. And so there may be some good reasons that they are a little bit less studied there as well. So I'm going to go through some work. This is a paper I'm just writing up at the moment on trying to understand and break down the different properties that a process would need to have in order to pose a risk of human extinction. And this is some classifications based around noticing that actually we're quite good normally at, there are some kind of serious barriers to something causing extinction. Firstly is that when we find something which is good for people, like we actively seek out things which are good for people, and then we find an activity that's good for people, and we say, great, let's do more of this, and we scale it up. When there are things which are bad for people, we have a whole lot of pressures like pushing against scaling those up, and indeed, to some extent, exploring things which might be very bad for people in the first place. So that's this first avoidance mechanism. And in order to get right to the end and cause human extinction, whatever process we're looking at has to somehow get through or get past each of these mechanisms. So they're a little bit, I'm not pointing quite to sharp concepts here, I think, but I think it's not that far off, and it can be a bit useful for trying to understand how we can break up this space. So then the response mechanism is this observation that, okay, if something is starting to do cause a lot of damage for very many people in the world, it is typically when things go badly, we at least try to stop them, to slow them down, to mitigate their effects. And in order to go extremely badly, it has to be able to, that our attempts to respond to this and to stop it are not enough to actually do that. And then finally is this observation that for many mechanisms which we can say, oh look, could be a huge catastrophe, it could kill millions or billions of people, it's actually quite a bit, maybe quite a bit harder again for it to kill every last person. And you can imagine cases where we do kill 7 billion people, and then we still have 100 million people left alive. And that although we've gone massively down on this, that's easily enough to potentially to rebuild up and recover from that. So this third question is like, why? How does it get everybody, or how does it stop us from recovering? And then we'll go each of these. Then I'll try and give kind of 3 different classifications of risks according to how it gets past each of these different things. And in So in the first case, how did it start? We looked briefly at this breakdown last week between natural risk and anthropogenic risk, which is where people are doing things. We think I covered, again, fairly briefly, arguments that anthropogenic risk is probably rather larger than natural risk. And then within anthropogenic risk, I think we can break it up a bit. First question is to ask, how many people are needed to cause, to set this going? And in theory, there's a continuum on that answer. It could be anywhere between one person, no people is the natural risk, things like asteroids, but one person, maybe this is some scientific experiment gone wrong, or some catastrophic terrorism if it's very easy to do, or a small group of people, and up to everybody in the world is needed to do this. And then it's a bit of an empirical claim that at least on a log scale, it seems like most of the things we imagine, which need people, either don't need too many people, it's kind of a handful of individuals up to maybe a few hundred or thousands, or need a very large number of people in the tens or hundreds of millions or billions, and that it's relatively less likely that it's in that middle ground. So that's if that empirical assumption turns out to be wrong, then this division will turn out to be less useful. But I think it looks kind of bimodal, so I'm trying to label this. And if it's few people,
Can you say a few concrete examples to see this?
Yeah, so I'll do this now when I go through these different categories. So within few people involved, either those people were trying to cause a lot of damage, and this is malicious risk, and so this is looks basically like some kind of extreme terrorism. Presumably, it looks like right now we don't think terrorists have any capability to actually cause extinction. It might be that you think if they could get access to the centralized control of the nuclear arsenal of the US or the Soviet Union, they could actually trigger something which would be large enough to eventually cause extinction. But maybe more plausible is actually if future technologies enable more power to be concentrated in the hands of individuals, then that might mean that malicious risk becomes a larger category in the future than it currently is. And so maybe this bioterrorism, where people engineer some kind of super pathogen which is very lethal and highly infectious and transmissible and has a long incubation period. Accident risk is probably the category of some scientific experiment or engineering process gone wrong. People speculated when we turn on particle colliders, look, this is creating conditions which we haven't hitherto observed. Maybe we should be a little cautious about this because it might be that there's some unknown physical phenomenon. People have speculated a little bit about the kind of thing that it could be, but there's certainly nothing that we actually think this is likely to happen. But maybe we're very unlucky and it does create something which propagates out and causes a lot of damage. People have talked about kind of creating a very small black hole which could then eat away the Earth. And, there are reasons to think maybe that is not plausible, but there's a class of things there that you can think. Maybe again, a dangerous pathogen escaping from an experiment where the people were not trying to cause lots of damage, but it happened. Maybe some of the risks from AI that people think about could be in this category, where they're building an AI and they think, oh, we're going to try and set it to, this is the kind of the genie problem. You have something very powerful and it will do exactly what you say, and you tell it something that you think is going to be great, and it turns out it wasn't great, and that would could be in the accident category. Then, if there are lots of people involved, basically either they know that there are bad effects to do with the associated with the thing that they're doing, and this is the tragedy of the commons scenario, commons risk, and like they do it anyway because it's good for them, even though it's globally bad. So there's a coordination failure that's necessary to have that. It might be that climate change is in that category. This is like, it's often thought of that people would love everybody to reduce their emissions, but nobody wants to unilaterally just start reducing their emissions. But then latent risk is the case where people are doing a thing, and like very many people are doing it because they don't know it's bad. And actually, maybe climate change as a risk, but not as a risk of extinction, falls in this commons risk category. We could, because when we've got these three things, you can try and categorize global catastrophes by passing through these first two mechanisms. And so you can use this for trying to categorize broader things than just extinction risks. Climate change, we actually don't think is likely to pose a risk of human extinction, but it might turn out to be significantly worse than our current projections. And in this case, it could be that actually it could serve as an example of latent risk, where we do this thing because we think, oh look, it's going to cause global warming, but and there's a bit of a coordination issue as well. It's like a bit bad, but it's not going to wipe everybody out. And then it turns out that it triggers some cascading catastrophic climate change, and this causes very much more damage than we were expecting. And we just didn't know in advance it was going to be bad. Maybe something like asbestos use. If it had turned out like it was used very widely, we didn't know it was bad for people, then we discovered it was bad for people and we stopped using it. But if it had been a lot worse, it might have posed a latent risk. Latent risk generally needs to have the harm be delayed from the activity, because otherwise there's no way that we can scale it up without realizing it's bad. Then, after it gets going, why don't we just stop it? And by the time we're able to kind of identify it as a risk and have an opportunity to interact with it, it needs to be not something that we can step in and prevent. And it therefore either needs to be extremely big, or it needs to be generating future processes in a way that pulls that are cascading. So that could be cascading in a way that's self-replicating, like a virus is. Maybe it's also cascading in a way that one process leads to disruption of another system. And so you set off something, and then it leads to disruption of the atmosphere, and then that leads to disruption of ecosystems, and there's collapse through that. And maybe just being extremely big or cascading very fast and I want to say virulently, which is the right word to use if we're talking about viruses. Not the right word to use for general cascading things, but I don't know exactly what the right word is. And some combination of these two. If it's cascading, then the larger it is when we can interact with it, the less it needs to be capable of kind of very rapid cascading and growing. And then there are a number of other exacerbating factors which seem to make it harder for us to respond effectively. One is if by its nature the risk impedes cooperation. So maybe we can imagine conflict could represent a risk. It could be a commons risk, because generally the people engaging in conflict, it's good for them even though it's net bad. And it could be that we have some small conflicts, and actually these just conflict engenders more conflict and this scales up and gets out of control. In our current regime, it seems like conflict doesn't work like this, but maybe some future switch in the way that things set up, or increase in the ability of individuals to cause large-scale damage could mean that conflict does tend to be self-propagating. And it very naturally impedes cooperation, and so makes it harder for the people to go, hey, this is net bad, let's stop doing it. If it's concealed or like plausibly doesn't represent a risk, then that makes it harder to coordinate around responding to this as well, or harder to just notice that we do need to do something. And finally, being on extreme timescales. So if it happens very fast, then we may not get our act together and respond in time. On the other hand, if it happens very slowly, if it's happening over a time span of hundreds of years, it may be that this is a problem which people think, oh, we can like leave this till later to deal with. And people have hypothesized that that's one of the things which presents an obstacle to action on climate change, is this relatively large timescale that's happening on. Then this question of how can it actually get to everybody? I've broken it up into direct risk, where the thing actually kills everybody, and indirect risk, where it doesn't itself kill all the people, but it does mean that they can't recover, or that they do go extinct. I'll just say a little bit about this, and then I want to move on and actually talk about how we can respond to these things. So, if it's going to kill everybody, it needs to get to all the places people are. And I can see three plausible mechanisms for this. One is it's basically just everywhere that people might plausibly be. So if we had something which was going to hit the entire surface of the planet, that would be an ubiquity risk. Another end is if it is actively seeking out people and trying to hurt them. So this is agency risk. This could happen because it's people doing this. This could also include other intelligences, either machine intelligence or being even more speculative, aliens could represent agency risk. In the middle is something which isn't everywhere, but is in all the places where the people are, because it's carried there by something by the people. Maybe if it's a highly infectious virus, it doesn't get to all the places on the Earth, but it does get to all the places where people travel. Or maybe it's transmitted not by the people themselves, but by something that they carry with them. So maybe it turns out that mobile phones are all going to be extremely dangerous later, and it turns out that people are carrying mobile phones pretty much everywhere. Indirect risk is ways that it could not kill everybody and yet cause extinction, or cause a fairly directly cause a lack of recovery. Habitat risk seems to be the main category here, where it's just doesn't leave us with an environment in which humans can thrive and continue to survive. Maybe because, so an example we were looking at before was all these things like asteroids or supervolcanoes or nuclear war, which might throw up a lot of dust into the atmosphere and reduce the sunlight and therefore make it basically impossible to grow food, could lead us. It doesn't directly kill people, but it leaves us with a habitat in which people cannot in the long term survive. Maybe something which also, if the something in the environment meant that the number of viable offspring per woman went down to less than one, and this was true over a sustained period, then that would not be an environment in which, in the long term, we can survive. Capability risk, I'm mostly trying to be careful here. It's not, this is the loss of some other important capability which would prevent us from recovering, or it's hard to point out things which seem like they're likely and lie in that category. Some people have suggested that actually, because we've burnt most of the fossil fuels, if civilization collapsed, we wouldn't be able to get back up to our current industrial level, because that was relied very strongly on this easy availability of fossil fuels. Though there are obviously, in scenarios where there's some kind of collapse there are a lot of things which are different, because there's a lot of things that we've extracted from the Earth and are now lying around on the surface. So I won't say too much about that. So there's an overview of this entire thing. And there is a rough attempt to try and classify some of these things into the different categories. But I want to move on to this section on strategic implications. So the first thing to saying, if it's correct that to cause extinction something needs to go past each of these three defense mechanisms, then the risk of extinction from a given cause is roughly the product of the probabilities of it getting past each of these different stages. So first of all, their conclusion is highest risk comes from things which can plausibly get past each of the different categories. Not that surprising. In some sense, it doesn't tell you anything new, but you can maybe use it to quickly go and check whether things, as a sanity check on whether things could pose extinction risks. Another is in terms of trying to reduce extinction risk from a given cause. In some senses, has to involve trying to reduce the chance that it gets past one of these barriers. And you might think, well, which one should you aim for? And this is a bit tentative, but with some plausible assumptions about the kind of returns we can expect from working on trying to strengthen each of the mechanisms and reduce the chance it can get past, it actually looks like it's probably worth doing this at each stage. And so at least some resources that a given risk, if the risk is worth responding to, you should put at least some resources into stopping it at each point along there, because that way you kind of sweep up the low-hanging fruit in each case. An exception is if it's just it looks extremely likely that it will bypass a particular stage. If it gets to that stage, then it's maybe not worth working there. Maybe the black hole that swallows up the Earth. If it gets started, there's probably not much we can do about that to save the Earth, and therefore we should focus on stopping it happening in the first place and helping the endurance mechanism. How could we do that? Well, by having people who are surviving and can continue to survive and are not based on Earth. Then generally this suggests some different strategies for reducing risk. We can try and intervene to prevent the you can try and intervene for a specific risk to prevent it passing one of these barriers. You can try and intervene for a class of risks to try and prevent it passing one of these barriers. So it might be that actually malicious risk you can deal with a lot of all at once by anti-extremism measures, and like reducing the pool of people who would be interested in doing this in the first place, or by monitoring people who might be, as well as perhaps some concrete things targeted at the specific ways that this could be caused. Also then trying to bolster the defences and bolster one of the mechanisms in general. So in general, for instance, international cooperation seems like it helps with a whole load of these things. It should, good enough international cooperation more or less rules out the commons risk. It should help people to better coordinate and give better chances of dealing with the origins of the malicious or accident risks, because dealing with these is a global public good, and individual nations often don't have enough incentives to unilaterally reduce them, so better coordination can help with that. And then it could also help with the responses, or with taking other steps that could reduce the risks. And so we could try to improve response capabilities and work out, try and get, if there is something that we're going to need to respond to, try to identify it earlier so that we have more time to respond to it. Try to have more resources on hand for responding. We can try to strengthen this endurance mechanism by making it harder for things to reach everybody. It's not clear how much we have good mechanisms for this. One thing which has been suggested is bunkers underground with kind of people semi-permanently living under there, so that even if there were a dangerous pandemic, there would be large enough pools of population which were isolated from this. So Nick Beckstead, who used to be a research fellow at the Institute, did some investigation into this. It looks like it's not a great thing to do at the moment. It might be that at some point this does look like it's a fairly promising way of improving. Actually spreading onto more than one planet also looks like it's a general thing which may reduce a number of these risks. Then I'm going to go on to this section 4 of like what can we actually do and different types of risk reduction work we can engage in. And I think that this largely splits into things which are more and less directly aimed at reducing risk. So if more directly aimed at it, you are, and these are all actually things which are aimed at particular risks, and this kind of categorization doesn't include the things that I was just mentioning on strengthening international cooperation, which looks like it is generically good, but this is all a little bit more focused than that. So direct risk reduction, you identify something you think is going to be bad and you want to avoid, and you say, okay, how do we stop that? Let's work out what the actual answer is as a society. And this might be a fairly technical answer. It might be that we go, okay, so the way to protect against super viruses is to have super antivirals that we can use, and like we just need to go and research these. Or if we're concerned about artificial intelligence, maybe there's an agenda of kind of AI safety, which if we just know all those things there, it's all going to be fine. And so it's understanding the nuts and bolts of what's actually involved in the risk and working out what technical solutions might look like and trying to build towards them. Then there's kind of policy solutions where you think maybe actually we can push back a lot against this malicious risk by having proper controls and just making sure that not everybody is like nuclear non-proliferation is a kind of example of this, where we tried to say, okay, we don't just let anybody build a nuclear weapon as soon as they're rich enough to afford And it's a relatively, my caricature is a relatively simplistic policy approach there. But there might be that for other risks, the main solutions are social or political, and about finding the right ways to organize ourselves as a society, and then going and looking for these ways would be this policy approach to solving the risk. I think that the technical and policy approaches are often both appropriate for many risks, but the actual balance of how I expect it to be solved does vary somewhat between these risks. Then you've got things which are less direct as a way of doing this. So one is forecasting. This is a little bit like something of what I've been trying to do here. And so studying the likely drivers and effects of the risk. I said forecasting because this is not something you can study by just going, saying, let's look at all the time this happened. Obviously, we haven't gone extinct yet. So it will involve some degree of modeling and projection out and trying to understand, okay, what are the firm bases that we can project out and we can have some confidence of versus where do we just have a lot of uncertainty. And steering work where you're trying to identify actually what the useful approaches for future work are and trying to improve the quality of the direction of work that people are putting into these areas. And then coalition building, so trying to get more people thinking, hey, actually, yes, this is something we should be doing something about. And there's lots of different subtypes of coalition building. This could just be, it's probably most relevant is often trying to get more buy-in from the professional communities who have who are the most relevant for the risk at hand. But it might be that some of it is about getting more buy-in from the political process more broadly, and there's different ways of going about this. So there's both direct and indirect risk reduction you can try and do. Which is better? How can we choose between these? And generally, it looks like the indirect approaches are better to be pushing on at the moment. So Toby Ord has a nice article presenting the case for this, and it boils down to a couple of things. One is that we're relatively, for many of these things, we expect, attention has been growing to the risks, and it seems plausible that attention to them will continue to grow, and then work that is done today will represent a relatively small proportion of the entire work that will be done. And also, for some of these risks, we just don't know enough yet. And if you think risks from future biotechnology, but you don't actually understand how the technology is going to work, you are going to be significantly less well placed than later people who do have that knowledge to actually go and identify which of the more direct risk reduction strategies look best. There are a couple of reasons which push back against this and say there's value in doing at least some direct work early. One is that it's probably not the kind of thing that you can scale up overnight. It's probably good to start building a community of people who are doing this, and so that you get expertise and you get institutions which are around doing that. And then also, related to that, demonstrating that there is useful direct work that can be done, which can help feed into this coalition building. Something that people sometimes say is, yes, this sounds concerning, but it doesn't look like we can do anything. And so being able to point to people and say, look, it looks like they are doing something and it looks useful, may be substantially useful for that coalition building. And then also, for any risks which could come soon, possibly unexpectedly soon, things which are indirect may be too slow. And if there is a risk which is going to transpire in 10 years' time, and that's the time that we need to be ready to respond, then only work in the next 10 years is going to have a chance of helping that. And so coalition building, which is aimed at having a larger community around this in 25 years' time, is just going to be too slow. And because the community is smaller at the moment than it's likely to be in the future, we represent a larger, people early represent a larger proportion of the total work that may be done on trying to reduce risks that can come early. So that is some reason to focus on the earlier risks, even when we think that they're unlikely. But I think there is a balance to be struck there, and that we should be doing some, quite a lot of, probably most of the work now should be this indirect risk reduction, but some of it should be the direct risk reduction. And that the direct risk reduction should be bearing in mind these two mechanisms whereby it's likely to be particularly useful, either by demonstrating the usefulness of and the ability to do direct risk reduction, or by being aimed particularly at risks which could come earlier than we expect. So, okay, I'll stop there and we can have some discussion. So the open questions I listed, though there were a lot more that were coming out of this, and feel free to move on to other things. Has everybody got a handout at this point? Okay, I won't bother reading out the open questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Might you be able, I speak on behalf of the poorly sighted, to send this out as an email so I can get my computer to read it to me?
Yes. I will give you my email address in a minute, and then you can do that.
Are you in coordination with other centers like the Center of Existential Risk or staff or
yes. So
the common agenda?
I think that there is no, there isn't a written common agenda that everybody is, these different centers are signed up to, but there's quite a lot of talk between the different centers and people having common aims and looking to help each other. So the Cambridge Centre is just starting. They've just got their first academic staff this year that are working full-time. But the Shauna Hegarty, who has done a lot of the work in setting it up, used to be at the Future of Humanity Institute and continues to work with people here and looking for opportunities for some joint projects between those centres. So in fact, I think the Future of Humanity Institute and the Cambridge Centre, the study of existential risk, have just got a grant together to run a centre looking at strategy and policy aspects of artificial intelligence safety.
What about government agencies? Sorry,
government agencies is something where I think there have been some conversations between people in this community and people in government agencies. There haven't been that many, and I expect that number to increase. But if you have suggestions of people that you think should be talked to, I would love to hear them. I think a question here, then there, then there.
On the note of government agencies, I suppose the kind of research done here is very public in a sense. And I mean, most governments do, threat analysis and security analysis. The departments who work with those kinds of things who kind of overlap with like the intelligence agencies, and the transparency for those agencies is not very big. So I mean, if someone from the NSA or whatever was here today and listened, would he just be chuckling because they have been doing this for 10 years, sequencing?
I think there are probably some aspects of the things which are being done, but probably most of the work that's here is projecting further out into the future than is normally studied by government agencies. And we do talk to them a bit. So the UK government has this National Risk Register, which lists risks to the country. And so it's catastrophic risks to the country. It's not as large as global catastrophic risks or existential risks. And there's a bit which is public, and there's a bit which is classified because it deals with more security risks, but that they use the same methodology. And Toby Ord and I went and talked to them about their methodology, because we actually said, there's a little bit of mathematics here that you're doing wrong, and maybe you can improve the analysis. So it's like that was a case of us trying to say, actually, this is important, what they're doing. We don't want to try and replicate their analysis of risks to the UK. We think it's fantastic that they're doing it, but there's an opportunity for us to try and improve the way they're doing it.
Also, like on the subject of forecasting, I mean, is there a way to use? Do you think there's a way to like use prediction markets to kind of help them? Obviously, because there's no outcome in which anyone can win. But I know Robin Hanson sort of talks about this idea of like auctioning tickets to get into a shelter, or that kind of thing. To sort of
this is like the general observation that prediction markets can be a good way of aggregating opinions and uncertainties and giving better probabilities to act upon than you can get by just asking people what probability do you think they should have. But it's hard to have prediction markets on chances of extinction because there's nobody there to collect. So I think there are some things you can do to get things in this vicinity. Even if you can't measure the chances of extinction, maybe you can use extinction markets to tell you something about the chances of near misses. So maybe times when people get past this, I'm not sure which one it's spinning anymore, but something gets started and it looks like it could go badly and then it doesn't. You can try and use markets to get a sense of the probabilities of those, or in some cases you can very exactly measure near misses. We could look at the asteroids passing within a certain number of Earth radii, and that should be fairly. There should be a pretty simple mathematical rule which tells you how the probability of that relates to the probability of one actually striking that. Hillary, and then.
So I'm not sure how useful this question is. It might just be one there's nothing interesting to say about. But I was finding that graph at the beginning, the one that graphs technological sophistication at time, for a number of reasons, and here's one of them. Isn't it really odd to think of extinction as being a point on the vertical axis? So I would have thought extinction is that, as I draw the graph, I've done the axes, now I start drawing the graph. Extinction is the point where the graph stops. We don't continue the line after.
Although,
and the vertical axis thing is kind of suggesting that the point where we go extinct is the point where our technological sophistication drops below a certain level, but that just doesn't seem right.
Well, if you think of that as our ability to manipulate things in the world, then extinction corresponds to being able to manipulate nothing in the world, more or less.
Yes, but it's not so much that we went extinct because we dropped below this. Anyway, maybe there's nothing useful to be said.
Yeah. I absolutely take the point. I'm not willing to defend the graphs all that much. I thought, oh, this paper does a good job of giving an overview of this, and I just listed it quickly without maybe giving myself as deep an understanding as I should have done. Be happy to have a conversation about this another time and try and get.
Sorry,
Was this a follow-on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just imagining that the reason that the topic chapter state sort of suggests non-extinction is that if it's a sort of scale of how well you're able to manipulate the world to the point where you're able to make a decision, we're not going to go extinct anymore. That's why the top section does do non-extinction.
Yeah, I'll just stop. So that'll be the next question.
Okay.
You made a nice remark about having resources ready earlier. If you drive down the Gallipoli Peninsula, you can see racks and racks of huge old World War I mines still waiting to be rolled out again for some future catastrophe, which is a sort of metaphor, really, for the fact that if you have resources ready, they're already out of date. Listening to you, what it seemed to me was that you were ignoring the extraordinary gap between scientific understanding and human political and motivational behavior. And as an art historian myself, I've looking at the way the arts have evolved, it does occur to me that the arts were on certain periods of development have been very much involved in the management of ecological risk, even if only telling when it's summer, when it's winter, and so on, and bringing their motivational engines. They get people adapted to the urgency surrounding them. And Nicholas Bostrom, in his, I think it was the 2013 paper, asked the question of whether there would be a consensuality to achieve remedies to any of the issues that he listed and that you listed today. And it was a very open question. And I wonder whether the very interesting areas of science that you represent are also taking a look at the humanities, the depth of human experience in sorting these sorts of things out, other than the solutions foreseen that will be provided at the moment by people like Mr. Putin. Whether there are other ways of communicating through the world which might minimize some of the risks that you've been talking about, as well as the rational congregation of rational people in small minorities to try and pool their experience and come up with some answers.
I think there's a lot that could be done there. There's a little bit that is being done. I kind of gestured towards it in my category of coalition building. But I don't feel like I'm an expert on this, and I'd love more people to work on.
Very briefly, there are no art historians or anything remotely to do with culture on the board of the Oxford Martin School. I don't know about your institute here, but I suspect it's very, very much the same. There seems to be a big gap between how humans behave and how human behavior is currently thought of.
Yes, I think that's probably right. I don't know. There's a lot of philosophers. I don't know if they're remotely similar to art historians or not. We have hit 4, so maybe we should stop there, but I'm happy to chat to people further. I don't know if there are refreshments or not this week. Kyle can.
Yes, there's chocolate biscuits.
Okay, great.
I'll just stay around and socialize.
Could you put up your email?
Yeah.